The development of new wireless technology, particularly mobile telephony, challenged the FCC's approach to both allocation and assignment. Let's first consider allocation. Cellular technology developed just as the FCC was wrestling with the demands for increased spectrum to be devoted to broadcast television. So the FCC resisted allocating any spectrum for this new technology, noting that it would not be in the public interest to assign a portion of the spectrum to a service which could adequately and feasibly use wire lines instead of radio. It wasn't until the early 1980s that the FCC allocated spectrum for cellular service. To do so, it drew upon spectrum that had initially been allocated to broadcasters, UHF channels 70 to 83. It assigned 2 licenses in each local market area, one to the incumbent local telephone provider and another to an independent provider. The FCC soon recognized that its allocation was insufficient to support true competition in mobile telephony. So what should the FCC do when it realizes that its allocation is insufficient to support a particular valuable service? Ideally, it looks to allocate additional spectrum. But the difficulty is that vacant spectrum may not be available to support innovative uses. So how does the FCC address that difficulty? If spectrum is not freely transferable, then the FCC has to develop a new band plan to shift spectrum to a more valuable use. Beginning in the early 1990s, the FCC sought to allocate more spectrum for the development of a mobile phone service, in this case, Personal Communication Services, or PCS. For technical reasons, that spectrum had to be located below 3 GHz. The FCC also concluded that it would be too disruptive to existing services, in this case broadcast, to locate the spectrum below 1 GHz. So within the 1 GHz to 3 GHz range, the FCC determined that there were only small slivers of spectrum, and that those slivers were incapable of supporting full implementation of a new service. The FCC therefore decided to relocate certain services, private and common carrier fixed microwave operations, to higher frequency bands, and to set aside 220 MHz of spectrum for PCS in place of those services. This reallocation required a lengthy transition. The FCC determined that some of the existing spectrum holders could continue to operate under licenses for 10 to 15 years on a co-primary basis. After that period of time, they'd be required to eliminate any interference with the new licensees, to negotiate an arrangement for continued operation, or to cease operation altogether. The FCC facilitated negotiations between existing license holders and new licensees and allowed private financial arrangements, so that the new licensees could hasten the relocation by paying the current spectrum holder to relocate or cease operations. The net effect of the reallocation was to profoundly change the mobile industry. The reallocation for PCS provided sufficient spectrum for bandwidth-intensive transmission, and thus laid the foundation for the broadband mobile services we now take for granted. By the year 2000, the tripling of the spectrum available for mobile phone use had the effect of tripling the number of subscribers, tripling investment, and tripling the employment in the industry. So the reallocation of spectrum for broadband PCS was a success story. But it's important to understand that the FCC can't simply decree that one use of spectrum is more valuable than another. The reallocation of spectrum for broadband PCS was achieved only through a lengthy rulemaking proceeding. The FCC had to propose its change in policy publicly, accept comments from interested parties, and respond to those comments in its final decision. Some rulemaking proceedings are highly contentious because incumbent spectrum license holders recognize the value of their spectrum and understandably will resist reallocation proposals. In the broadband PCS proceeding, it took the FCC 3 years to make the decision to reallocate spectrum to this innovative use. Let's now consider the FCC's approach to assignment. In theory, merit-based hearings were designed to help the FCC judge which applicant for a service would best serve the public interest. That process was questioned even for broadcast licenses. But as new wireless technologies developed, merit-based hearings seemed poorly tailored to assigning licenses, for example, for determining who would provide the best mobile phone service. In 1982, Congress authorized the FCC to assign licenses by lottery. That model likewise proved controversial. Licenses were thought to be so valuable that the number of applications well exceeded the capacity of the FCC to process them, by one account causing the partial collapse of the FCC facility storing the applications. Moreover, the lottery winner could immediately transfer the license for a very high price and receive a windfall. So in 1993, Congress authorized the FCC to assign some licenses through government-sponsored auctions. In implementing that authority, the FCC began with PCS licenses. The first auctions for licenses that had been reallocated for broadband PCS occurred between 1994 and 1995 and generated over $7 billion. In 1997, Congress mandated that the FCC assign spectrum use rights through auctions except in the case of digital television service. The reallocation of spectrum for broadband PCS services had an extraordinary impact on wireless development. In the last 2 decades, the FCC has continued to reallocate spectrum in an attempt to support demands for new wireless services. Likewise, the assignment of the licenses through auctions marked a significant shift in U.S. wireless policy. Spectrum auctions have proven a major revenue source for the government, producing over $100 billion in the last 2 decades. But concerns remain that the federal government's spectrum policy still prevents spectrum from being put to its most valuable use. In the context of allocation, for example, the FCC still performs the central function of deciding what spectrum can be put to what use. In many cases, its predictions about how much spectrum are needed for a particular purpose are not correct. That was true of the initial allocation for UHF television. In the transition to digital television between 1996 and 2009, the government may have allocated too much spectrum to existing broadcasters. So to free up some of that spectrum, the FCC is now planning incentive auctions that would permit broadcasters to share in the revenue that comes from reallocating and reassigning portions of their spectrum. Another complicating factor is that much spectrum remains in the hands of the federal government. A key institutional consideration comes into play. The FCC only regulates private and state and local government uses of the radio spectrum. The Communications Act of 1934 assigned to the President the task of regulating the federal government's use of the radio spectrum. The President, in turn, has delegated this authority, most recently to the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, within the Department of Commerce. This division of authority between the FCC and the NTIA complicates management of the radio spectrum. If a particular government agency is not making efficient use of its spectrum, the FCC can't reallocate that spectrum to a different use without coordinating with NTIA. So despite the many changes that we've seen to spectrum management policies, we still need to wrestle with the problem of spectrum scarcity.